We're going to talk about the Arab Empire and its successors. So we actually have quite a bit to talk about. So we're going to talk about the growth of the Arab Empire into what you see here on this map, and then we'll even talk about the Mongols and kind of how they played a role in uh, the the way the Arab Empire is shaped, and they're going to take over some land and that. So, all right, so let's go. So after Muhammad died, so his this left his followers with the problem of succession. So this is where we talked about before about the Sunnis and the Shias. This is where they split, is at Muhammad's death. So it's very early on. He didn't have any sons, and his daughters couldn't lead in a male-dominated society. So some of Muhammad's closest followers chose Abu Bakr. Okay, so this is Muhammad's father-in-law. Uh, and they're going to name him what's called Caliph. Okay, a Caliph is a successor to Muhammad. But there was a small group that believed the successor should actually go to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the cousin and son in law of Muhammad and the father of Muhammad's grandchildren. So the people who believed it was Abu Bakr that should have been first are known as the Sunnis, and then the Shia believes that it should have been Ali. So Islam grew under Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph, and the Muslims expanded over Arabia and beyond. So to spread the movement, he took part in what's called the jihad. So jihad is the struggle in the way of God. Excuse me. So we talk a little bit about that and what that's supposed to be versus what it is sometimes in practice. In 650, Egypt, Syria, and the Persian Empire were part of the Arab Empire. And the Arabs were very fierce fighters, and they were led by very good generals. That was one thing that the Arabs had, was they had very brilliant generals. And their courage was enhanced by the belief that if you were a warrior killed in battle, then you are assured to go to paradise, okay, which is their heaven. The next two caliphs to rule were both assassinated, and in 656, Muhammad's son-in-law Ali, who the Shia originally wanted, became caliph. So it seems like the Shia actually ended up getting their way, but that split still continues to this day, even though Ali does eventually become caliph. His reign saw civil war, and then in 661 he was assassinated, and then his sons, he had two sons that could have taken over, but they don't. One is going to be assassinated, they're pretty sure, by poison, another one's going to be killed in battle. So when the Arabs took over, they were tolerant in their conquered territories. Many of the people there retained their governments, and they didn't force anybody to convert to Islam, but they very much encouraged them to do so. And so they basically made it so if you stick with your religion, you have to pay more in taxes. Well, people don't like paying taxes, and so most of the Arab Empire became Muslim as a result because people were not willing necessarily to give up their money for their religion. Some people weren't. Some people were. The Umayyads. So in 661, the general Muawiyah, he is going to become caliph. Now he was a rival of Ali, and it's believed that he was the one that killed. I think it was Hussein was the name of Ali's son who could have taken over. And then Hassan was another one who died in battle, but that was like 20 years later. But anyway, so he is known for one major virtue, that he used force only if necessary. And he's also going to make the caliphate hereditary. And so this is going to begin what's known as the Umayyad dynasty. And he's going to move the capital from Medina, which was in Saudi Arabia, to Damascus, which is in Syria. And in the 8th century, Arabs had conquered and converted the Berbers. So the Berbers are a nomadic people. They're pastoral, and they mostly hang out on the edges of cities. And they raise cattle and that. But they're very nomadic. They move around a lot and search of food for their cattle. In 710, the Arab and the Berber forces occupied southern Spain. And so by 725, most of Spain had become a Muslim state, which is weird because when we think about Spain today, we think of it as being very Catholic. but at the time in 725, it had become Muslim. Arab forces were defeated at the Battle of Tours, which is in France, and so this actually brought an end to the expansion of the Muslims into Europe. And so they conquered much of Spain, but they didn't get past they didn't get past into France. So this right here shows the Umayyad Empire. Okay, so you could see this is the original empire from Muhammad. Okay, and then under the first three caliphs, so that's up to Ali. Okay, so that's where this is, and then the Umayyad Caliphate expanded it all the way to the yellow. So they control a lot of the known world. In 717, Muslims are going to sack Constantinople, which was part of the Byzantine Empire, and they will defeat the Byzantine Empire. But this will create tension in Asia Minor between the Byzantines, who are Christians, and then the Muslims. And so internal struggles are going to start to happen as well. The leaders are going to favor the Arabs, and revolts will break out. Most of the leaders were Arabic. Even though the Arab Empire had spread out so much, not all of those people are considered Arab. In 680, Hussein, who was the second son of Ali, battled against the Umayyad rule, and he died in battle, like I said. But most of his followers defected, and they fought 10,000 soldiers with only 72 warriors. So it was 10,000 against 72. All of them died. This struggle caused Islam to split into two groups. So, like I said before, you have the Shia or the Shiite, who are believe that the descendants of Ali should rule, and then the Sunni, who say it was the Umayyads or the true caliphs. And to this day, they are still two different sects, and they still don't get along in many cases. So the Sunni have, and they're considered like the more traditional, more conservative sect, and they really rely on what's called the Sunnah. The Sunnah is a body of basically rules, and that's basically the basis of Sharia law. And then the Shia, they are a very small percentage. They only make about 10% of the total Muslim population of the world, where the Sunni are obviously the much larger group. So, okay. The Abbasid dynasty. So in 750, Abu al-Abbas is going to overthrow the Umayyad dynasty, and he's going to found the Abbasid dynasty. And in 752, he's going to make a new capital, so he's going to move it from Damascus to Baghdad, which is in Iraq. It's sitting right on the Tigris River. Very easy to travel to. And he's going to move east, and he's going to increase the Persian influence because Baghdad was the center of the Persian Empire. And so judges, merchants, and government officials were now the new heroes, not necessarily the warriors anymore. And he says they basically made the rule that all Muslims, Arab or not, could now hold civil and military offices. So you didn't have to be Arab to hold office. And so that was very important. In the 9th century, the reign of Harun al-Rashid is considered the dynasty's golden age. So this is him right here, or a depiction of him. But he was known for his charity and patronage of the arts. And then his son, al-Mamun, was a great patron of learning. And he supported the astronomical investigations and translated Greek works. And it's because of this that the Muslims, because of him, are really going to become much more advanced in technology than what we see going on in Europe at the time. So in Europe at the time, this is like the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, basically, of Europe. But in the Middle East, we're starting to see kind of a flourishing of learning and the arts. So Baghdad is going to become the center of a trade empire from Asia to Africa to Europe. And so the caliph is now more of a regal position, so more royal, and then the bureaucracy has become more complex as a result of increased trade and increased land. So he had a council that was headed by a vizier that advised him, and during meetings the caliph would sit behind a screen and then whisper order to his vizier as kind of a show of power that he doesn't necessarily have to be there, but he's still the one pulling the strings. So they did have problems. So they fought over succession to the caliphate. Al Rashid's two sons almost destroyed Baghdad in their fight for succession. Their great wealth that they had gained from such a large trading empire led to financial corruption, which that's almost always going to happen. And then there was a shortage of qualified Arabs that allowed the non-Arabs to become more powerful in the military and bureaucracy. And when you do that, it's kind of like what happened when we talked about with Rome, where you have the less actual Romans in charge, and things get messy, they get complicated. And so finally, the rulers of the provinces began to break from the central government. So Spain, Morocco, and Egypt established their own caliphates, and Egypt, they made what's called the Fatimid dynasty. So the Seljuk Turks and the Crusades. So the Fatimid dynasty soon became the center of Islamic civilization, and they're going to play a major role in trade because of their position on the Nile. Okay, so they're right here, and so they're on the Nile. The Nile River goes through here, and they're also obviously right on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they're going to create a strong army by hiring non-native soldiers, and one of these groups is called the Seljuk Turks. And so the Seljuk Turks, they were nomadic people from Central Asia, so they're from this area up here, okay? And they converted to Islam, and they prospered as soldiers for the Abbasid Caliphate. And then in the 11th century, they're going to take over the eastern part of the Abbasid Empire. And then in 1055, the Turkish leader will eventually capture Baghdad and take over the empire. So his new title is going to be Sultan. Okay, Sultan means holder of power. Okay, so this right here is the Fatimid Caliphate, and their extension of their land. So the Seljuk Turks held the political and military power in the Abbasid Empire, and then the Turks are going to take over the Anatolian Peninsula, where present-day Turkey is, hence the name. And Emperor Alexius I, who was the emperor for the Byzantine Empire, asked the Christian states of Europe for help. And he's going to appeal to the Pope. Okay, and then in 1096, this is when we start to see a series of crusades begin, because the Byzantine Empire is really getting beaten down by these Turks. Okay, and so at first the Crusaders put the Muslims on the defensive. The first crusade was the only crusade to actually be successful, because they did actually capture Jerusalem and set up some Crusader states, but a lot of the Crusaders left after the First Crusade and went back home to Europe. Well, once they did that, the Seljuk Turks, they're from there, so they just went back and took their land back. In 1169, Saladin, this was in, I believe, the Third Crusade, is going to take control of Egypt, and that's going to end the Fatimid dynasty, and then he's going to go on the offensive. He's going to be up against Richard III, or Richard the Lionhearted from England. That battle is those two are going to be the major players in this crusade. And in 1187, Saladin's army will destroy the Christian forces in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The biggest effect of the Crusades, and we're going to talk about this a lot in the next unit as well, but the main effect of the Crusades was basically it bred centuries of mistrust between Muslims and Christians. The Mongols. So in the 13th century, the Mongols, who are pastoral people, they're coming out of Asia. They're going to take control of much of the known world. They were highly, highly destructive conquerors. Their goal was to create terror, so people wouldn't fight back. So they didn't care if you liked them or not. They just wanted you scared of them. In 1258, the Mongols seized Persia and Mesopotamia, and their leader Hulegu hated Islam, and so he destroyed Baghdad, including all the mosques, and the Abbasid Caliphate ended there. And then the Mongols advanced as far as the Red Sea, but they did not get to Egypt. They did not conquer Egypt. And so they met resistance of the Mamluks, and these guys were the Turkish slave soldiers, so they were part of the Seljuk Turks, who took control after overthrowing the government that Saladin had set up. Okay, so this right here shows the extension of the Mongol Empire around 1300, and you can see that they're they're into Europe. Okay, so they're taking over much of the Middle East. So this right here is where Persia is. So this is where we're talking about here. So the Mongol rulers began to convert to Islam, and they started to intermarry with local people. So that was something that the Khans had really encouraged. And so they began to rebuild some cities. And in the 14th century, the Mongol Empire split into separate kingdoms. And then the Islamic Empire had begun in the 7th and 8th centuries. That empire had ended. But because the Mongols had destroyed Baghdad, Cairo actually will become now the center of Islamic civilization. So here's Baghdad, that's in Iraq, and now Cairo sits right next to Alexandria. It's like right here. And so that's going to be the new center of Islamic civilization. But you can see here, this is the khanates, the different khanates that as they got split up. Okay, and that's all I got for you today. Don't forget to do your processor, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.